So right now I have the cup that we were working on earlier. It is still pretty wet, and I wanted to show you the difference between wet clay and leather hard clay. And so with this piece, you can see that if I were to touch it, I'm touching it pretty gently, it changes the form of the cup pretty drastically. And so I think this is an example of wet clay. At this point, you would cut it off the banding wheel using a wire cutter. For the wire cutter, you want to make sure there aren't any hard kinks. This one's an older wire cutter, so there is. I'll just twist that part around my finger. You want to make sure you use your thumbs and press the wire onto the wheel. Otherwise, it'll pull up and cut off the bottom of your piece. Especially with hand-built pieces, you want to make sure you maintain the thickness of your bottom until you trim it. So I'll hold it here. I will pull it best I can. I can tell mine pulled up some because my wheel was moving. But you'll take it off. Yeah, you can see where it's pretty uneven, so you want to try and pull it down more if you could. At this point, I would wrap that piece up. I'm not wrapping mine up because it's just a demo cup. You scrape off your wheel, and you would either work on another piece, or you would get out a piece you had that was drying, which is what I'm going to do. In this bag, I have a cup I worked on yesterday. This cup I used 5 coils on, so you can kind of see the height difference. It's still a little thick and it's still a little wet, but for the most part, when I hit it with my fingers, the form isn't changing. You can also see on this cup that I tried to get the same lip on it, roughly. And so right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the final stages of smoothing, and I'm going to trim this cup. So as you can see, the bottom is a little thicker, so I might scrape that off. Now this form, this really smooth form, is what I like to think of as a blank canvas. You can continue smoothing it and let the glaze that you later add to the firework be the decoration, or you can pick up some of your tools and carve a design. But right now what I'm going to do is take this off and flip it upside down. So I don't have foam in my home studio, but what I do have is a rag or a washcloth. What I might do instead of just setting this on my board is I would set down something soft, because although my piece is leather hard, my rim is still a little damp. And how you'll know that is by when I picked it up, it changed shape, and also when I put my fingernail into it, it leaves a fingernail mark. So I'll lay it down or sit it down on here, making sure that it's pretty secure in the center of my piece. And I will begin using my carving tools. And so I have a few carving tools. I can also use my smoothing tools, and I'm going to begin removing clay from the base. If you'll remember, our base is probably this thick. If you fire clay that is this thick without addressing the bottom of it, it will explode in the kiln. And if it doesn't explode, it'll crack to where it won't hold liquid. And so it's very, very important that we remove clay from this bottom. One way that I like to do it is just by at first putting my finger on the center of the cup and taking clay away. Now you can see mine's still a little wet. You might actually wait another day before you do this. Yes, this piece is actually probably too wet right now, but I'll go ahead and finish the introduction to the trimming video. So I like a rounded bottom to my cup. You don't have to do it this way. You could honestly trim it flat with this tool, but we're actually working towards making a foot. And a foot is a lifted section beneath your cup that will either allow you to hold it or will keep your cup the same height you initially had it without exploding in the kiln. And so for my foot, I'm taking off clay around the edge. That's where I find it's the thickest, because not only did I have the base, which was really thick, I also added a relatively thick coil to the outside. And so this part is very thick, and I'm trying to thin it down some. I'm keeping my fingers on the top. You can keep 1 finger, 2 fingers, whatever you think, but it's important because if you unknowingly apply too much pressure with your carving hand, it could change the form of your piece a lot, or it could just knock the piece off, which could be equally detrimental because it could get a dent in it that you couldn't get out. So this process could go on for a really long time. As you can see, my trim section is not very clean. It's probably because my piece is too wet right now. If you want your work to dry more in the course of a day, you might not tie it in the plastic bag. You might cover it in a piece of cloth or leave the bag open in sections. Drying is one of the trickiest parts of working with clay. Your students will be devastated if they come in and find their clay work dried out and hardened where they can't carve it. But they'll also be frustrated if they lose a whole day of work because their piece wasn't dry enough. So I would experiment with drying time on your own before you teach a clay lesson. So right now, like I said, this is a little too wet, but I still want to show you what sections are best to trim. So right now, I've kind of trimmed the edges. I might come back in as I continue to trim and get the sides some. Shorter motions instead of longer motions are easier to control. So at this point, I would probably take my smoothing or my scraping tool and I would come at the base. And as you can see, it looks pretty similar to when we first scraped the side of our cup. This is something that you would just keep doing. You can also use this tool if your clay's wet or if it's dry to remove clay. You can see that clay is coming off of it. So I would probably, on one cup, try to keep your trimming time down as much as possible, especially on your first cup, because regardless of how careful you are, it will likely still be too thick on the bottom. And the longer you spend trimming, the thinner it will get, but at the same time, you don't want to devote several hours to trimming a clay work when you're not going to get that out of the piece if you were to, say, sell it. You want to try to keep the work time you have in each cup pretty low. If you're trying to sell it, or if you're in a classroom setting, you're just going to be limited with time. You may only have 30 or 45 minutes with a set of students, on a good day. And so that's not including getting materials out, cleaning up materials. So you want to tell them and encourage them that this first cup they're making will likely not be fired anyway. It's to develop their technique. And so this is something that would look pretty typical of what I would make, a rounded bottom. I would continue to smooth it, but you'll notice that there is still a lot of weight in the middle. So the sides are thinner. They could probably afford to still lose some thickness, but the center is very thick. And when I first began making clay cups and bowls, I found that the center bit of my piece was where I would get an S-crack. Now for me, it was because I wanted a super smooth texture, and so I would dip my sponge in water, and I would come back and I would smooth the edges. And it took me a long time to learn that adding water will only ensure cracks in your piece, that you need to keep your clay moist, and that you need to work without water as much as possible. But it was also because I was adding water and leaving too much clay. And so for your piece, once you get your sides, whatever design that you want, you could have it rounded, more sharp, more angular. You want to take a smaller carving tool. This is one I like to use. It has a rounded end and a squared end, but you could use anything. You could use your knife, you could use this larger tool, and I would draw a shape. And so because my bottom's round, I'm going to use my needle tool and I'm going to draw a round center. I like to leave a wider foot or a wider base. This is what's going to be touching the table. You want to try as best as possible not to smooth or carve on the piece of your clay cup that is going to touch the table. You want it to be flat, otherwise it'll rock when it sits. And so I've drawn my circle. Now I'm going to take my carving tool and I'm going to remove clay in that circle. I would recommend that you go gingerly at first or carefully, because nothing is worse than putting all of this time into your clay piece to carve through the bottom. I've carved through my share of bottoms. It's not a big deal. You can repair it if your clay is still wet enough, but it might be devastating to a beginning student. So I want to tell them to make sure and go carefully at first. This little well, because you're not going to be glazing this bottom piece, you're actually not going to be glazing probably an inch up the side of your cup, just because if your glaze runs, it'll stick to your kiln shelves and it will ruin them, and kiln shelves can be hundreds of dollars, and so you want to make sure students don't glaze the bottom of their work. But this little well can sometimes be glazed, and in my personal work, I know I like to glaze this little tiny empty well where I have removed clay from the bottom of my cup, and that's where I put my initials with my needle tool. I think it was fun when I first began working with clay. Our professor encouraged us to practice and pin what we were going to sign our clay pieces as, because he said that just putting your initials wasn't very interesting and that many of us had the same initials. And so I remember being excited about going back to my house or my apartment afterwards and developing my design. I know that initially I used a needle tool and drew my design, but as I continued to work with clay, I created a stamp. And so it's kind of a fun discussion with your students on what their mark is going to be. And this is a cool place to put that mark. And so at this point, I'm probably not going to use my scraping tool just because it's such a narrow area. I will continue to scrape perhaps the surface of my cup and use my fingers, but on the foot, especially this part, I like to use my finger. It is a better size proportion for this little well, and so I'll go in, I'll just begin to smooth it. It's also great because with your finger, you have a better depth perception. You can understand how much clay is left in this foot just by feeling it. You can probably tell which areas are thinner, you may have carved deeper, or if perhaps you've gotten too close to the inside bottom. Mine's feeling pretty good. So the only thing I might do on this cup is, like I've mentioned before, continue smoothing. I like my pieces really smooth, but I do need to experiment more with texture. So it's up to you. This is something that would look like the bottom of my cup, most of my cups at least. So at this point, I would flip it over. You don't need that tool anymore, and you can see on my rim. Can you? Oh my God! Pause it.